A soldier turns a corner in Mexico City and stops. There is no one in front of him. No army. No formation. Just a narrow colonial street, shuttered windows on both sides, and the kind of silence that every combat veteran learns to fear. Then the first cobblestone hits. It comes from above, from a rooftop he cannot see, and it strikes the man beside him so hard it caves the side of his skull. Before anyone can react, the windows open. Rifle fire punches through the dust. Men are dropping in the street, and somewhere deeper in the city, the church bells begin to ring. Not a celebration, a signal. This is not a retreating army making one last stand. This is an entire city, its bakers, its priests, its market workers, its mothers, that has decided it would rather kill than surrender. And the date is September 14th, 1847. The same morning that General Winfield Scott rode his white horse into the Zocalo for the painting that would define this war for the next 170 years. That painting is what America chose to remember. What happened in the streets, just outside its frame, is what America chose to erase. The official story said the war was over. The Mexican army had broken. The capital had fallen. The government had fled north in the night, and by morning the American flag was rising over the National Palace. Scott's officers were already composing their dispatches, the language soaring, the tone triumphant. Destiny fulfilled, the continent secured, the republic extended to its natural limits. Back in Washington, they were printing the headlines before the ink was dry. But on the ground, in the actual streets of Mexico City, something was happening that none of those dispatches would describe with any accuracy. The Peralvillo district opened fire first, then the alleys near the Old Market, then the towers of churches that had stood for 2 centuries. The resistance did not come from soldiers. It came from neighborhoods, from men who had watched a foreign army march into their capital and decided that no treaty signed by a government they hadn't chosen obligated them to accept it quietly. From women who threw roof tiles because roof tiles were what they had. From a population that understood, with complete clarity, that the people now occupying their streets had not come as liberators. American patrols moving through side streets were ambushed from above and below simultaneously. Units that lost cohesion in the labyrinth of colonial alleyways did not always find their way back. A lieutenant in one regiment wrote home that he had never felt more exposed in his life, not at any of the formal pitched battles, not crossing any river under fire, than he did trying to move 4 men through a single block in the center of Mexico City, while the entire architecture of the place seemed to be shooting down at them. The buildings themselves had become the enemy. General Scott had not prepared for this. He had prepared for a formal occupation, a ceremonial transfer of authority, the dignified administration of a surrendered city. What he received instead was something that military planners in that era had almost no framework to process. A civilian insurgency embedded inside a dense urban environment, using its own geography as a force multiplier, capable of disappearing into the population between engagements and reappearing somewhere else entirely. His response was swift, and it was brutal, and it was, by the standards of the campaign he had run to that point, remarkably unconcerned with appearances. Martial law was declared within hours. Scott issued written orders that still exist in the historical record, stating that any structure from which fire was taken could be destroyed. Collective punishment was authorized for neighborhoods deemed to be harboring resistance fighters. His soldiers, many of them teenagers, many of them at the far end of a campaign that had already cost more than anyone had publicly admitted, carried out those orders with the particular ruthlessness of men who are frightened and have been handed official permission to stop restraining themselves. Doors were broken down, families were pulled into the streets, homes were put to the torch. The city did not go quiet for days, and through all of it, through the smoke and the street-to-street fighting, and the court-martial proceedings, and the grinding chaos of an occupation unraveling in real time, General Scott kept returning his attention to a specific group of prisoners held under heavy guard at a particular location. He had arranged for them to be positioned where they could see a certain hill, a certain castle, a certain flag still flying over its walls. He needed them alive. But only until one specific moment. Who were these men? That question has one answer, and it is the answer that cracks the entire official mythology of this war open at its foundation. History gave them a single sentence when it mentioned them at all. American deserters. Irish. Executed for treason. That sentence was engineered to end the conversation before it could begin. Because the moment you actually look at who these men were, where they came from, what they saw, what they decided, and why, the comfortable story of a righteous American war of continental expansion becomes very difficult to hold together. They called themselves the San Patricios, St. Patrick's Battalion. Most of them had arrived in the United States with nothing. Irish Catholic immigrants, the majority of them fleeing a famine that was killing their country by slow degrees, who stepped off ships into American port cities and immediately discovered they had traded one form of destitution for another. They were poor, visibly Catholic, and regarded by substantial portions of American society as a social problem rather than a population. The signs in certain windows were not subtle. The violence in certain neighborhoods was not occasional. The U.S. Army took them anyway, because it needed bodies, and bodies were what these men had to offer, and it marched them toward Mexico. Somewhere in the long march souths, something clarified for some of them. The precise moment varies in the accounts that survive, and historians continue to debate whether the defections were primarily ideological or primarily opportunistic, whether these men were making a principled stand or simply recognizing a better offer when they saw one. The evidence, honestly, supports both readings for different individuals within the battalion, but the pattern that emerges across most of the accounts is consistent. They crossed into Mexico and found something they had not expected to find: a Catholic country. Churches built in the same architectural tradition as the ones the English crown had spent centuries destroying in Ireland. Mass spoken in the same liturgical Latin their mothers had whispered over rosary beads in the dark. People who did not look at them with the contempt they had absorbed as a baseline condition of their American experience. They were fighting a Catholic people on behalf of a Protestant empire that had already made clear it considered them expendable. That was the recognition, and for several hundred men it proved sufficient. Mexico understood what it was looking at. The Mexican commanders extended their offer openly: land grants, officers' pay, rank that actually meant something, and the dignity of fighting for a cause rather than simply being consumed by one. The found purchase. Somewhere between 250 and 300 men crossed the Rio Grande and changed allegiance. They organized under a green silk banner, a harp on one face, the image of St. Patrick on the other, Eringo brag stitched across the field in gold thread. They were not a propaganda symbol. They were a functioning military unit, specifically an artillery battalion, and they were genuinely dangerous. At Churubusco in August of 1847, the San Patricios were operating Mexican cannon against the American advance. American officers who lived through that engagement described the artillery opposition in private correspondence as unlike anything encountered in the entire campaign. Sustained, accurate, and tactically sophisticated in ways that suggested a level of training and experience the Mexican army alone would not have possessed. It was sophisticated because the men behind those guns had been trained on identical weapons by the United States Army. They knew the range tables. They understood the reload sequences. They had practiced on American ordnance, and they were applying that education with precision against American formations. They were turning American institutional knowledge against American soldiers. That is what made them so threatening to Scott. Not the desertion itself. Desertion was a constant in that war, as it is in most wars. What made the San Patricios intolerable was what they represented. They were proof, walking and breathing and firing cannon, that the men who had been sent to fight this war were not unanimously persuaded by its justifications, that the cause was transparent enough for its own soldiers to examine it and walk away, that the enemy was comprehensible enough, human enough, sympathetic enough to earn the loyalty of men the United States had recruited and trained. That story could not be allowed to circulate. When Churubusco finally fell, the surviving San Patricios were taken prisoner. The tribunals were not extended proceedings. Evidence was presented, sentences were pronounced, and 72 men were condemned to death. 16 were spared the noose, some on the narrow legal grounds that their desertion had technically preceded the formal declaration of war, a distinction the court chose to treat as meaningful. Those 16 men were flogged until their backs were open. They were branded on the cheekbone with a hot iron stamp in the shape of the letter D, and they were kept alive specifically to watch what happened to the others. Scott had decided that what happened to the others would be a lesson written large enough that no one present would ever unsee it. September 13th, 1847. Before dawn, 50 condemned men are loaded onto wagons. The city is still dark. The altitude makes the morning cold in a way that is sudden and physical, and the men are not dressed for it. Their wrists are bound behind their backs. One by one, the nooses are placed, rope against the skin of the neck. The hangman's knot set, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before and intends to do it correctly. And then the wagons do not move. The trapdoors do not drop. The men stand there, already noosed, already sentenced, the rope already touching them, and they wait in the grey half-light while the city comes awake around them. On the hill in the near distance, visible from where the wagons are positioned, Chapultepec Castle still flies the Mexican flag. Scott's assault on the castle has already begun. The condemned men can hear it. Artillery rounds crossing the valley carry a sound that is less like an explosion, and more like the air itself being struck, a deep concussive thud that you feel in the chest before you hear it with your ears. Smoke is rising from the fortifications. Through the morning haze, figures are visible on the ramparts. The castle is still holding. Scott's order had been specific, and it had been deliberate. The executions would proceed at the exact moment the Mexican flag over Chapultepec was replaced by the American flag, not before. The timing was not a matter of military logistics. It was a decision about meaning. It was designed so that the last image these men registered before they died would be the symbol of the cause they had chosen being pulled down and replaced. The battle for Chapultepec did not go quickly. The Mexican defenders, including, famously, the young military cadets who chose to remain at their posts when retreat was ordered, held the walls longer than Scott's timetable had anticipated. The American assault stalled. There were minutes, possibly longer, when it was genuinely unclear from the valley floor which direction the battle would break. On the wagons, 50 men stood with ropes around their necks and watched, whatever they thought in those hours, and no account survives from any of them. They would have understood the arithmetic of their situation completely. As long as that flag was still flying, the order could not be carried out. Every minute the Mexican defenders held was another minute of life. Every setback in the American assault was, from the wagons, something close to hope. The castle did not hold. When the American flag finally rose over the battlements of Chapultepec, the trapdoors fell, 50 men, simultaneously. The sound of it was not what most people imagine. The ropes, the weight, the sudden violence of 50 drops, happening in the same instant. Witnesses described it as a single sound, dense and final, followed immediately by silence. It is the largest mass military execution in American history. Scott had calibrated every element of it for maximum psychological effect. The location, the sight lines, the timing, the audience of branded survivors forced to watch from the ground. The message was constructed with the same care a general applies to a tactical problem. And like most messages written in that language, it was received exactly as intended. The following morning, Scott rode his white horse into the Zocalo. The painting was commissioned. The image was composed. The frame was drawn carefully around the parts worth keeping, and the work of managing what the American public would be permitted to understand about the preceding weeks began almost immediately. The dispatches arriving in Washington described a just military punishment administered with appropriate solemnity to men who had betrayed their oaths. The language was measured. The framing was clean. The specific details, the hours of standing on wagons with nooses already fitted, the theatrical alignment with the flag change, the simultaneous drop, did not appear in any version circulated for public consumption. The newspapers followed the dispatches, as newspapers in 1847 largely did. The civilian insurgency was reframed as the disorganized final spasm of a population that had not yet processed the reality of its defeat. The martial law, the burned houses, the collective punishments imposed on entire neighborhoods, these were either omitted or described in language that made them sound like regrettable but necessary administrative measures rather than the urban warfare they actually were. The San Patricios were reduced to a footnote, then a sentence. Then, across most of what eventually became the standard American account of the Mexican-American War, nothing recognizable at all. Here is where historians genuinely disagree, and the disagreement is worth sitting with, because the answer changes the nature of the failure. One interpretation holds that the omission was active. The civilian uprising lasted days and was directly witnessed by thousands of American soldiers, men who wrote about it in letters and diaries and unofficial correspondence. That material existed, and portions of it have been recovered. And yet, within a single generation, the dominant American narrative had compressed the entire affair into something nearly bloodless. A campaign of military brilliance culminating in providential expansion, with no meaningful civilian resistance and no mass execution in the public memory. That degree of compression, this argument holds, is not what organic forgetting produces. It is what deliberate editing produces. The structural counter-argument holds that no coordination was necessary. American newspapers, historians, and educators in 1847 were already operating inside a worldview that had pre-decided the war's moral status. Within that framework, the San Patricios were traitors. The civilian resistance was lawlessness, and there was genuinely nothing, from the perspective of the people doing the writing, that seemed to require suppression. There was simply nothing that seemed worth preserving. Both positions carry weight. But the structural reading has a weakness its advocates rarely address. The private record, the letters, the diaries, the personal accounts never intended for publication, shows that American soldiers on the ground did not share the clean interpretive framework of the newspapers. They used words like atrocity. They wrote about specific scenes they could not stop replaying. Some of them carried an explicit moral discomfort about what they had participated in for the rest of their documented lives. That awareness existed in 1847, in the men who were there, in the words they chose when they thought no one official was reading. It did not enter the history, which means someone, not necessarily in a coordinated conspiracy, but someone repeatedly, across many decisions made by many people over many years, decided that it should not. The story was shaped, the shaping was consistent, and the consistency was not accidental. While America was quietly filing these events away, Mexico was building monuments. Streets in Mexico City carry the San Patricios name today. There are plaques at the execution sites. Every September, a formal ceremony is held, attended by officials from both Ireland and Mexico, at the location where 50 men once stood on wagons and waited for a distant flag to change. The Irish government recognizes them as a matter of national record. Mexico teaches their story in its schools, as a matter of standard curriculum. In the United States, the institutional silence has remained largely intact for nearly 2 centuries. That divergence is not a footnote. It is the thesis. It is a sustained verdict, maintained across generations of editorial and educational choices, about whose deaths are dignified enough to preserve and whose can be quietly set aside without consequence. The painting of Winfield Scott on his white horse is still reproduced. The 50 men on the wagons are not. And when you fully absorb what that means, when you understand that an entire government, an entire press apparatus, and generations of educators could take the bloodiest, most morally contested weeks of the 19th century American military record and reduce them to half a paragraph about destiny and expansion, only one serious question remains. If they could erase this, what else did they decide you didn't need to know? Tell me in the comments which part of this history had no right to be buried. I want to know which piece of it stays with you.